She fined me $1,000 for swimming in my own lake. So I wrote her a bill for $5,000 and mailed it to her with certified return receipt. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far HOA power reaches. If your neighborhood ever felt smaller than it should, stick with me. This one's going to sting. The HOA meeting hall smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. The room was full of folding chairs and folding loyalties. The president, Karen Whitcomb, 57, hair like a silver helmet, voice like a church bell that had forgotten mercy, tapped her gavel and announced the fine with the kind of public relish usually reserved for wedding toasts and tax audits. People clapped politely. Some clapped with knives in their palms. The sheriff's deputy in the corner shuffled paper, eyes flicking like a fly caught in amber. The notice on my door had been stamped at 9. The envelope still had dew on it from the lake. The paper said I had violated Section 42C. Unauthorized. Use of community waters. I had been in the water at dawn. I had been humming an old Coast Guard cadence. I had been under a sky that smelled of wet pine and gasoline from a neighbor's lawn tractor, tasting salt and algae on my lips. This opens as close to the end as I could get without spoiling the feel of the verdict. The room was 2 breaths away from a lynch mob, and 1 breath away from a laughable bureaucratic shrug. Karen lifted her chin and smiled the kind of smile that thinks statutes are swords. My hands were steady in my lap, palms dry, scarred where a hook once took me during a house fire. He had been a firefighter for 12 years. He had taught himself to read building plans the way other men read horoscopes. He had a veteran's habit of noticing the seams where things could be pulled apart. His name was Daniel Reyes, known as Danny to the kids who jumped from his dock, and to the mail carrier who always over-saluted. He was not rich. He owned the riparian edge of the lake because his grandfather had filed a deed in 1952 that smelled of brass ink and hope. He had built a life by repairing things people said were done for. He was the sort of man who could carry a piano up 3 flights and not breathe hard. He had the calm, precise patience of someone who had once found a person under a collapsed roof and carried them out with his bare back. The audience smelled wood polish and nervous mint gum. A woman behind me clicked her tongue like a metronome. The projector light hummed, creating a rectangle of washed-out proof. Someone in the back laughed, a thin, quick laugh, and then covered their mouth as if the room itself could be offended by that sound. Karen's silvery SUV idled outside, the engine's diesel stench drifting in when the back door opened. There was a thumbnail moment waiting to be frozen into a still. Karen's face, pinched, eyes sharp with entitlement. The deputy's notepad, open to the page with my name. My grandfather's deed folded in my pocket like an ancient coin. The gavel came down. Flashback. The lake, back when it was a rumor told among fishermen, had been Daniel's sanctuary. The water ran cold enough to keep whiskey sharp and kept a man honest about his sins. The smell of catfish and fried batter lingered at the annual Docks and Donuts breakfast. He remembers the first time he dove off his grandfather's old cedar dock and felt something like belonging fill him. Like the lake recognized him and let him keep his secrets. The neighborhood was a scatter of trailers and clapboard houses, a few new mansions stitched into the map like bad teeth. We want to keep our property values up, Karen liked to say, pronouncing property like it was a deity. People agreed because their home loans were long and their patience short. In those first years, community meetings were where casserole recipes were traded, and the word covenant meant an awkward promise to mow your lawn. Karen transformed covenant into a weapon. She had a way of saying bylaw that made trustees nod as if she had read the Bible aloud. She liked order the way some people like perfume. She spritzed it liberally. She owned a neatness that bordered on hunger. Her nails were always carefully buffed, her shirts always tucked. She had a volunteer position that unfolded into the kind of power that makes small towns forget what it is like to be human. She drove the same silver SUV to every meeting and brought the same lemon cake, the frosting arranged like a coronation. You could see the way people leaned into her jokes, the way they leaned away from the people she had marked. Every now and then the narrator, the storyteller with a cop's eye and a reporter's patience, will note how the smallest legal phrases, the tiniest slips of ink in older deeds, can tilt an entire fight. Danny kept a small leather folder, the kind beloved by archivists and men who think paper is a kind of prayer. In it were his grandfather's deed, a 1973 topo map, and Notes with arrows and exclamation marks. He treated documents like living things. Read aloud, warmed between palms, coaxed into telling their story. He had a tactical mind honed by smoke and structural collapse. He had a habit, when angry, of tracing the edges of legal papers as if he could find a fault line. The first sign of trouble came like a mosquito at twilight, small and irritating and easy to ignore. Karen sent a letter. The envelope smelled of copier toner and the thin skitter of office dust. It said, "To the homeowner at 12 Willow Lane. You are in violation of Quick Reg 110B." It had no signature, but the HOA's. In the margin, someone had written precedent and circled it like a victory wreath. Daniel read it on the porch where the light smelled of lemon and old rope. He felt something cold and electric at the back of his neck. He called the number listed. A woman answered with a clipped voice and told him to take care of it. He asked what the violation actually meant. She told him it meant he had used community water without authorization. He laughed then, and the sound was wet with disbelief. Later, that week, a neighbor's kid, Jake, came running down the bank with bloody knees, breath rasping, cursing because he'd slipped on algae. The smell of skinned skin and pond rot filled the air. Danny sat him on the dock and felt the boy's pulse under the soft skin of his wrist. He taught him how to clean the scrapes, how to wrap with gauze if there was no antiseptic. He told Jake to go home and tell his mother he'd learned to be careful. He did not tell Jake that a piece of paper somewhere believed the lake belonged to everyone but him. A second small blow. A notice about restricted recreational use posted at the lake's entrance. The new sign was green and glossy. The paint still smelled of solvent. It had been installed at midnight, the screws still warm. Karen claimed community safety. The sign quoted a clause about common areas and member privileges. The clause sounded like a story told to scare children. Clear, authoritative, and wrong. Someone had forged the words to fit a picture of cleanliness. People started to whisper. Some whispered that Karen's husband had a construction company that wanted to reroute part of the shoreline for a private dock of his. Some whispered that the HOA's reserve fund had become a black hole. Others whispered that the lake had always been a public miracle, and no one had the right to privatize sunlight and ducks. The smell of gossip was coppery and dry on the tongue. Knowledge. Bomb 1 dropped in the middle of anger and coffee. Most HOAs can't simply create a new restriction that contradicts your deed. Covenants recorded earlier on the property typically take precedence. But only if the deed language is clear, and you can prove continuous use. Daniel read this aloud to his neighbor at the docks, because sometimes laws are best learned aloud, like prayers. He underlined recorded earlier, and felt that underlined sentence like a compass. He knew his grandfather's deed predated the HOA's formation by decades. That meant he had a thread to pull, if he could find the start of the seam. The meetings became a steady erosion. Karen would take 5 minutes to call someone out. She would conjure bylaws that had been sitting dormant and wave them like muscles. She had the cunning of someone who knew that people will always believe the loudest voice in a room, especially if they also happen to bake the best lemon cake. She began a campaign of fines and warnings. Monday. A $200 notice for unauthorized banked firewood. Tuesday. A $150 fine for improperly stored kayak. Wednesday. An anonymous complaint about a rooster that had not crowed in 5 years. People liked order even when it bit them. The subtle threat tasted like metal. Danny watched as the community's solidarity frayed. He watched the way some folks stopped talking to the elderly man who fished at night because his boat was unapproved. He watched mothers pull their children from his dock at social gatherings because noise bylaws had been invoked. The sound of the children's feet receded like tide. The lake, which had been loud with frogs and laughter and the metallic clink of oars, became measured. The sunlight on the water was still bright, but the brightness felt expensive now, like jewelry under glass. He felt the change physically. The back of his throat tightened, his hands clenched, and an old ache in his left shoulder, the memory of a falling beam, woke up. He began to document. Smell, sight, touch, damp paper, pencil lead in his teeth, the scratch of his pen like a metronome. He recorded the dates of every fine, the names of every complainant. The times the HOA's emails came through with subject lines like immediate action required. He copied county property records at the public office where the paper smelled of ink and municipal sweat. The clerk, a woman with a cigarette voice, watched with bored interest and then handed him a stapled packet. The maps were slowly revealing themselves, like veins in a leaf. He found an old survey from 1950 that showed the lake's edge, where his grandfather had fished. The surveyor's notes were written in blue ink, the kind that had faded into solemnity. He traced the line with his thumb and felt a tremor, a tiny electric confirmation. As Karen's fines piled up, so did the HOA's theatrics. They held a special meeting to vote on a safety ordinance. The word safety tasted of vinegar in Danny's mouth. The hall filled with people wearing faces like stitched quilts. Some angry, some afraid, many eager to be seen. Karen produced a glossy packet bound with a black clip and read aloud about safety risks and liability exposure. Her voice was oil-slicked and reverent. She pointed to a chart that listed incidents at the lake. 1. A slip in 2017. 2. A complaint about unsightly plywood in 2019. The chart would have been laughable if it wasn't so meticulously compiled. Every incident was real enough, but context was a currency Karen spent only on herself. There were whispers about the HOA's bank account. There were whispers that the board had voted to divert funds toward the president's discretionary landscaping improvements, a phrase that tasted of roses and embezzlement when said aloud in certain rooms. A neighbor who worked as an accountant, a soft woman with a pencil-stained blouse, whispered into Daniel's ear that the HOA's reserve study had inconsistencies. The reserve fund numbers were off by the same amount it would cost to hire someone to reroute a few shoreline posts, the exact amount of the contractor's bid. Danny felt the room tilt toward conspiracy and then right itself like a ship correcting course. He started to suspect that this wasn't about water safety at all. That suspicion hardened under pressure. The HOA began to ring the bell of legal intimidation. Letters became suits. A certified notice landed at Daniel's door. $1,000 fine for unauthorized use. The paper smelled of the type of institutional ink that wants to be obeyed. The deputy delivered the notice with a professional shrug. His hands smelled faintly of fried onions. At the hearing, Karen, dressed in pearls and sarcasm, she told a story about safety, about precedent, about the sanctity of community standards. She said the words, member privilege, like someone blessing an altar. Her husband, a man who sold landscape supplies and knew how to price gravel, sat with a face tuned to the frequency of entitlement. Danny's allies were a motley crew. There was Maria, who ran the bait shop and smelled like gasoline and fried dough. There was Mr. Lowell, a retired surveyor with hands like salted rope and a cough that kept time with the seasons. And there was Tara, a young lawyer who grew up on the lake and wore her outrage like armor. Tara liked to remind people that unfair systems often hide in plain sight. She had a knack for finding precedent like picking ripe fruit. When she said quiet title in a hushed coffee shop, she made it sound like a tool and a promise. She showed Daniel a 2-paragraph county statute about riparian rights that tasted like salt and old wood when she read it aloud. Her fingers drummed, a quick morse on the table, the rhythm of someone who believed law could be a scalpel. There were micro cliffhangers in every exchange. The HOA's lawyer sent a threatening email that ended with, additional remedies include injunctive relief. The subject line read, immediate action required. The lights in the coffee shop hummed. People's spoons clinked. Maria's phone buzzed, with a text from a neighbor threatening to stop patronizing her shop unless she stayed out of HOA politics. The text made the air taste metallic. Daniel felt the sting of community turning small, like a hand gone cold. He decided to fight back, the only way he knew how, with patient surgical pressure. He would not storm the meeting with torches and hashtags. He would comb through the county clerk's office records. He would dig up the HOA's incorporation documents, and he would talk to the old men who remembered when the lake was public land, and there was no HOA with a smile like a guillotine. He would use Karen's own obsession with paper and form against her. The first tactical move was small, a thumbnail of what would become a much larger reveal. Danny requested copies of the HOA's recorded covenants and the minutes from the meeting where the new water restriction had been passed. He made the request in person because handwriting matters. The clerk stamped his request and looked at him as if he had asked for a banned book. In the packet was a page where the voting record had a gap. Someone had notarized a line without a signature next to it. Someone, and the idea tasted like gasoline, had quietly amended a covenant without properly recording the notice to all members. Knowledge bomb 2, halfway through the first escalation. Recorded covenants and the chain of title matter. Amendments to HOA rules generally require proper notice and a quorum as stated in the original governing documents. If notice wasn't given, or the amendment wasn't properly recorded, the amendment can be void, especially against owners who have older recorded deeds. Tara and Daniel stood under the humming fluorescence and read the clause until the words felt like iron. He learned that HOAs often hide in procedural fog. When you clear the fog, the structure that looked immovable sometimes crumbles like wet sand. At night, when the rest of the neighborhood slept with their air conditioners humming like distant bees, Daniel sat in his kitchen with the papers spread out and the smell of black coffee curling like smoke. He compared the dates, lined up the notarized stamps, and noticed discrepancies. A page had been notarized with the wrong county clerk's name. A signature looped where a printed name should have been. He called Mr. Lowell and asked him to come by with his old surveying instruments. Mr. Lowell smelled of motor oil and old paper, and the cigarette he kept in the corner of his mouth like punctuation. He squinted at the documents and said, "This looks like cheap work, son. Cheap and dangerous." The community's mood shifted like a barometer before a storm. Some people joined him quietly, dropping off documents in his mailbox, whispering names of meetings they'd never been invited to, telling him where the HOA's funds went and what improvements were promised and never delivered. The smell of trust in those exchanges was brief and sweet. Others watched him with hard eyes, as if he might be a heretic asking too many questions about the faithful. Karen's smile did not crack, but in the tiny fissure rippling across the surface she did something she never did in public. She rolled a coin in her hand, a nervous habit that tasted like old metal and a secret. The cliffhanger at the end of Act 1. Daniel discovered an invoice. A contractor's bid for $5,000 worth of shoreline remediation signed by Karen's husband, dated 2 weeks before the restrictive amendment was recorded. The invoice smelled of printer ink and the sweet deception of timing. It matched a transfer in the HOA account that had no line item explanation. The numbers lined up like tracks in snow. He had the invoice in his hand when he found a notation in the HOA minutes that read, "Motion approved pending funding." The motion had been passed at a meeting where the minutes showed 3 absent members who later swore they had never been notified. The paper in his hand felt heavier than it should. He folded the invoice, wrapped it in a paper towel, and placed it in his leather folder where his grandfather's deed slept. The folder smelled like cedar and history and the quiet electricity of imminent change. The lake outside his window looked ordinary, a sheet of early evening glass reflecting a sky that had no idea a war was about to start. But under the surface, something shifted. The water was deeper than the message on the letterhead. The first act ended on the sound of someone turning a key. The lock clicked. The gavel's echo still hung in the meeting hall like last night's. Cigarettes. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. The invoice felt heavier the second time Daniel slid it under the lamp as, if the paper had soaked up the lake's cold and the town's indifference. He sat at his kitchen table with the leather folder open and the night pressing windows like palms. The coffee on the counter had gone bitter and lukewarm. The kettle hummed faintly as if trying to remember a song. He could hear the distant drone of a highway and the soft, irregular chirp of crickets that seemed to count down his patience. He ran a thumb over the contractor's signature and tasted iron on his tongue. The metallic tang of something about to be pried loose. He felt the first real pulse of the fight. Not a flare, but a slow-burning, methodical pressure that would need every patience he had. He had a firefighter's habit when things were about to go sideways. Check the exits, count your people, make a plan. He did those things before he lit a match. The next morning the lake looked like a sheet of hammered pewter, the surface catching sun in cheap reflections. The smell of damp earth rose when he stepped outside. The dock creaked under his boots like a tired throat. Maria handed him a coffee, as if it were an armor piece, and Mr. Lowell squinted at the invoice with a cigarette-smudged frown, his fingers smelling of tar and motor oil. Tara arrived with a leather-bound briefcase that smelled like new stationery and righteous anger. The air tasted of diesel and toast, and in the grocery lot a delivery truck backed in, the engine sighing like a tired animal. People glanced at the paper in his hands the way you glance at an exposed nerve. He started with small surgical strikes. He filed a request for the HOA's bank statements, the meeting minutes for the last 3 years, and contractor bids that matched the remediation invoice. He made the requests as if he were ordering parts from a catalog. Precise, polite, impossible to refuse. The HOA obligingly sent a thin packet that looked like a confession in office lighting. Photocopies with edges clipped, a smear of thumb oil, initials scrawled in haste. Underneath a patchy section labeled Shoreline Improvements, a transfer line matched the invoice amount, $5,000, and the transfer was signed by Karen Whitcomb. The smell of printer ink and the faint metallic tang of the new disclosures stung like a slap. He photocopied the documents at the public library where the copier coughed and the fluorescent lights buzzed. The pages came out with little ghosts of other pages, as if the truth was being ghosted into being. Tara sat with him in the study of the bait shop, the wood smelling of old nets and fried fish, and pointed at entries where the HOA's minutes admitted funding approved pending vendor selection. But with no evidence of bids sought or quorum reached. She tapped the paper with a pen that left a faint indent on the page. The sound was decisive, like a hammer setting a nail. "They're sloppy," she said, and the word landed heavy. "Or they think you're stupid enough to ignore it." He posted a blurry photograph on the lake's community Facebook page. The shiny new sign at the entrance, the glossy green board with crisp letters proclaiming restrictions, the HOA logo gleaming as if sanctified. The comment thread blossomed, like mildew. Someone accused him of stirring trouble. Someone else posted a childhood photo of Karen handing out cookies at a bake sale, the picture smell of nostalgia and complaint. A few neighbors wrote that they'd always trusted the board. Others whispered about money speaking louder than community. The thread became a small, noisy battlefield where words tasted like pennies and anger. He began to collect testimony. Maria brought receipts for bait purchases and a note from a local accountant who had once done pro bono bookkeeping for the HOA. The accountant, a wiry man with coffee breath, had flagged strange transfers. He smelled of paper and suspicion. Mr. Lowell delivered an old map with ink smudged by decades. It smelled faintly of attic dust and mothballs. The map had a hand-drawn boundary showing the public access at the north end of the lake, a small notch the size of a thumbprint. "This was never owned by anyone when my wife and I moved in," Mr. Lowell said, his voice rasping like an old engine. "Folks fished off here. Kids swam off here. It's common." The words filled the bait shop and tasted of loss. Midday brought a discovery that tasted like a rotten seed in a good apple. An invoice stub, a carbon copy, a note with a phone number that tied the contractor to Karen's husband's landscaping company. The number matched a line item in the HOA's invoices. The air around Danny felt narrower, like the first squeeze on a wound. He called the number and listened to a recorded message before a human picked up. The voice professional, clipped, like a deadline. He let the phone ring twice more and then hung up, taste of lemon substitute on his tongue. He knew he could prove a conflict of interest if he connected the transfer, the bid, and the vote. He knew he needed a clean chain, evidence that would hold under scrutiny. He pushed further. He requested a formal hearing on the fine and demanded a full accounting. The HOA responded with form letters smelling faintly of copier toner and the authority of unchecked habit. They offered a hearing date. The date was set to a Tuesday at 5, the hour when most working people were still at work and unable to attend. Tara grinned at that, a small, sharp thing. "Convenience is a tactic," she said, folding her hands on the table. The bait shop smelled of spilled coffee and paperbacks. She suggested he insist on a time when the maximum number of members could attend. He did. The HOA responded with stone-cold procedure. They escalated in the way bureaucrats do, methodically, like frost, forming. Notices went out, fines, fees, threats of liens. The tone of their communications shifted from officious to punitive. A mechanic's lien notice arrived at his door marked with legalese that tasted like paper and cold metal. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Someone had been told their boat license was revoked. Someone else's flowers were declared unapproved. The community's hum shifted toward panic. The smell of fear was distinct, coppery, and wet. Municipalities have rhythms. There are days when the clerk's window is a warm sun, and days when it's a barred gate. Daniel learned the rhythm. He learned the names of the clerks, their coffee orders, the hours when they were most likely to be generous with paper. He sat in municipal rooms that smelled of lemon oil and processed paper, asked for historical minutes, and then sat back as the pages revealed a pattern. He discovered a gap. An amendment to the HOA covenants had been recorded without proper notice to all members as required by the original governing documents. The notation meant the water use restriction might be void if challenged. The discovery tasted like a half-light of hope. Knowledge bomb 1. The law in their county, and similar counties across the state, required that amendments to recorded covenants follow explicit notice procedures and a quorum vote as specified in the original documents. If an amendment was recorded without following those procedures, the amendment could be challenged and potentially voided. Having a recorded deed that predates the HOA's formation could give homeowners a stronger position. Tara read the statute, aloud over the table in the bait shop, the words crisp like toast. The knowing made the room smell like possibility. It wasn't an automatic win, but it was a tool, and tools in the hands of someone who knows how to use them can change outcomes. Armed with that, Daniel organized. He printed handbills that smelled faintly of copier glue and handed them out. At the hardware store, the diner, the post office. HOA scandal? Attend the hearing, one read, the letters bold as a promise. He used the words the algorithm liked. HOA, takedown, illegal, scandal, exposed. He posted them on bulletin boards, where the pins left little red dots like miniature wounds. He asked neighbors to bring evidence. He told them to bring stories. People came with soggy photographs, faded receipts, and memories that tasted like backyard barbecue smoke and old sunscreen. The hearing started with a room full of faces that smelled of yard work and anxiety. Karen arrived in a blouse the color of cream and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Her perfume smelled of something muted and meticulously chosen, like the way she curated the minutes. She set her packet of papers on the table, thick enough to be a defense and thin enough to be an inconvenience. The deputy sat quietly at the edge, hands folded, smelling faintly of air freshener and routine. The board read their statement. Daniel's folder lay open like a revealed palm. When testimony began, the HOA's lawyer, a man with a voice trained to flatten resistance, rose to speak. His words were oil-slick and rehearsed. He spoke of bylaws and member privileges. He used safety as a talisman. Karen's voice was precise for once. She recited incidents and liabilities like a preacher reading the warning signs. People heard the word liability, and visions of lost savings and ruined properties flashed like storm clouds. The room smelled of nervous cigarettes and peppermint gum. Someone whispered that the HOA was protecting property values. Someone else whispered that they were protecting something else entirely. Tara cross-examined with the ease of someone who had grown up having to knock on doors and ask for truth. She asked questions like she was lifting lids, polite, methodical, exposing grime underneath. She asked who contracted the work and who approved the bids. She asked whether member notices had been sent. She asked whether minutes were amended retroactively. The lawyer smiled as if to say the questions were small. But Tara kept asking, and in asking, she opened a seam. Someone in the back stood and said they had not been notified about the vote. The person smelled like a lawnmower and sadness. Another neighbor produced an envelope that had the HOA's letterhead, but was dated after the recorded amendment, proof that notice was not timely. The documents carried the smell of old glue and the real weight of human habit. Members shifted. The air tasted like winter. The HOA's rhetoric pivoted toward escalation. When words didn't intimidate, they used leverage. They recorded a lien. The deputy delivered notices that felt like anchors, cold and heavy. The lien threatened to strip property titles if unpaid. The men from the county recorder's office spoke in a language of forms and boxes, smelling faintly of institutional coffee. The lien was a weapon the HOA could deploy to scare neighbors into compliance. It was designed to look like inevitability. The community began to fray in a new way. People who had once mowed their lawns and waved now pulled their curtains and avoided Saturday barbecues. The smell of grilling decreased. Daniel felt the pressure the way a swimmer feels under a wave, a weight from above, patient and immovable. Yet the raft of neighbors at his door grew. People who had paid fines without question, people who had let fear buy them into silence. They told him about other small cruelties, a garden bed flagged by the board for being non-conforming, a child's tire swing labeled eye hazard. The stories smelled like fertilizer and old candy wrappers. Then, the attack shifted. Anonymous. Flyers appeared on doorsteps with grainy photos of Daniel on a dock wearing a wetsuit, a headline accusing him of destructive behavior. The smear smelled like printer toner and broken glass. Someone started a rumor that he had built a private dock that blocked public access, a direct hit to his reputation. His inbox filled with thinly veiled threats and cold admonitions. The house that once buzzed with neighborhood kids now hummed with the low frequency of unease. The sound of his phone buzzing became a metronome counting down his patience. It was in the middle of that pressure that he found the bank ledger entry that would change everything. Sifting through the HOA's disclosures, the ones they had sent grudgingly, he noticed a pattern of small transfers to a landscape improvements account, then larger transfers to vendors linked to Karen's husband's company. The smell of paper and stale breath in the county office felt electric. He made copies and took them to the accountant neighbor who sniffed numbers like a hound. The accountant's eyes widened, and he said a word like a punch. Conflict of interest. The term hung in the air, tasting like rust and guilt. Knowledge bomb too. In many jurisdictions, board members and officers of an HOA have fiduciary duties to the association. They must act in the association's best interest and avoid self-dealing. Self-dealing transactions, where a director benefits personally from association funds without full disclosure and proper approval, can expose the board to legal liability and remedies, including rescission or damages. The accountant's voice was steady as he presented a ledger printout and a timeline that made the word pending funding look like an alibi. Daniel felt the room tilt. If he could prove self-dealing, the HOA's maneuvers could collapse under the weight of their own impropriety. Armed with that, the group pressed harder. They filed a complaint with the state's Homeowners Association Regulatory Agency and prepared a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty. Media outreach followed. A local independent reporter, a woman with a camera that smelled like oil and battery acid, arrived and wanted to know about HOA takedown and scandal exposed, in a tone that tasted like an opportunity for public truth. She asked for on-camera interviews and snippets, short, kinetic moments that would make for a thumbnail. Maria offered a shot of Karen stepping out of her silver SUV, the camera catching the way she clicked her tongue like a metronome. The microphone smelled of rubber and beat potential. Daniel felt proud and exposed in equal measure. He was suddenly the protagonist in a drama that required more than a firefighter's steady hands. It needed legal strategy and public pressure. Tara filed motions, drafted a complaint, and smoothed the jagged edges of the community's grievances into something a court could understand. Daniel learned deposition etiquette, how to breathe, how to answer only the question asked, how to keep one's face a plain lake. He practiced in front of Mr. Lowell, who barked advice like a coach and smelled like tobacco and repair glue. The preparations felt tactile, each document a stone put in place for a bridge. Then, in a move that felt like a counter-move from a chess master who had misjudged the board, Karen filed a counterclaim that Daniel had interfered with HOA operations and had defamed the board online. The claim read like the stab of a thin, precise knife. The smell of ink on the filing tasted like salt. The attorney representing the HOA spoke about injunctive relief, a phrase meant to sound surgical. Maria's bait shop saw a rush of customers who whispered the word scandal like it was sticky honey. People wanted drama served hot. The community polarized. At the hardware store, customers argued about property rights and whether someone could really own a lake. The smell of sawdust mixed with debate. Friends who had once shared bills and recipes now picked sides. Some supported regulation for safety. Some saw the HOA as a tyrant abusing its reach. Tara reminded them of the broader stakes. If an HOA could fabricate notice and direct funds to a preferred vendor, then every homeowner had reason to fear. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice steady like a bell. "This is about legal transparency and justice." Social media amplified the fight. A short video clip of Karen at the hearing, smiling in a way that looked rehearsed, went semi-viral in the neighboring counties. Comments ranged from outraged to dismissive. Someone posted a photo of the invoice with the caption, "HOA scandal exposed. Illegal contracts." The word illegal hung in the thread like a red flare. People who had been silent now felt emboldened to speak. The smell of old grievances vented into fresh air. At the same time, the HOA pushed procedural levers. They attempted an emergency motion to restrict access to certain parts of the lake, citing unforeseen safety hazards. The motion smelled of legal grease and opportunism. They attached affidavits from unnamed concerned members. The court calendar, usually napping in bureaucracy, woke up. Tara filed an emergency opposition and demanded proof. She asked for specifics, dates, witnesses, inspection reports. The HOA produced a vague report with photocopied pages and a stamp that looked suspiciously like haste. The court asked for clarity. The judge, a woman with a gavel that smelled faintly of polished wood and authority, ordered a temporary, restraining order hearing. In the days leading up to the hearing, people brought chairs to the courthouse. The sound of folding metal sang like protest. The courthouse hallway smelled of floor polish and tense perfume. Neighbors who had once exchanged casseroles stood with flyers in their hands. The news camera arrived early, the lens cold and hungry. The thumbnail-ready visuals were obvious. Karen's lipstick-stained smile as she walked in, Daniel's leather folder clutched like a badge, Tara's legal pad, and the camera's red record light blinking like an eye. Tara prepared a mountain of evidence: bank transfers, minutes with missing signatures, emails that showed a pattern of selective notice, and the contractor's bid with its suspicious timing. She prepared witnesses: Mr. Lowell with his map, Maria with her receipts, and a former HOA treasurer who had blown the whistle and smelled like old coffee and a bad conscience. The evidence was tactile: receipts, phone records, paper trail, and it carried the smell of cold water poured over a burning ember, enough to put it out if used correctly. The day of the hearing, the air felt like a held breath. The courtroom smelled of mildewed paper and tension. The judge looked at the assembled parties as if he could weigh them with a glance. The camera's light was a small, hot sun focusing on people like flies. Tara's cross-examination was surgical. She asked for the method behind the alleged emergency. She pressed for inspection reports, for contractor bids, for the exact language of the vote that had purportedly authorized the restrictions. The HOA's lawyer looked like a man whose script had been rearranged. Karen's husband got up to testify, and, for the first time, his voice wavered. He smelled of engine oil and something like regret. Under Tara's careful questioning, he admitted that the contractor's bid had been presented after the vote, not before. An odd sequence if the vote was meant to fund a specific vendor. The air tasted sour. The judge frowned. The lean of the room shifted like wind through dry corn stalks. Then, as if trying to beat the room with a final assault, the HOA's lawyer slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a signed affidavit. A neighbor sworn to have witnessed dangerous swimming conditions at the lake that justified the HOA's emergency measure. The paper smelled of ink and constructed certainty. The neighbor who signed the affidavit had, in other contexts, been a reliable face at bake sales. The judge let the affidavit rest on the bench like a pebble that might, with a flick, cause ripples. Tara wanted to test the affidavit. She asked for the neighbor to be present in person. The neighbor did not appear. In his stead came a faxed copy with a scrambled header. The room smelled like burnt toast. The judge's pen hovered. The air tasted like a storm about to break. The judge asked for verification. The HOA asked for time. The balance teetered. For a moment, the outcome looked like it could hinge on whether a single signature was authentic. Knowledge Bomb 3. Civil procedure matters. Affidavits and sworn declarations carry weight but require authentication. Courts often require the presence of the affiant for cross-examination or verifiable proof that the document is genuine. If an affidavit is fabricated or presented without proper verification, it can be stricken and may expose the presenter to sanctions for fraud on the court. Tara's request for the affiant's presence was not just a tactic, it was a rule of evidence designed to prevent manufactured emergency. The judge's pen hovered because the law loves precision. When precision is missing, the scaffolding of a case can creak. Outside, the courthouse steps smelled of exhaust and folding chairs being carried away. People muttered and shifted like leaves. Cameras filed footage that would be clipped and sent. Into the digital streams, the keywords, HOA, justice, scandal, exposed, already humming in metadata like bees sensing sugar. The case had become something bigger than a lake. It was about procedure, accountability, and the quiet rules that keep communities honest. Tara's cross-examination had not yet won the day, but it had unsettled the opposition. Back at the bait shop, they debriefed like soldiers between operations. The smell of grease and coffee filled the room. Daniel's hands shook once when he set his mug down. He asked a question he didn't want to sound like a man afraid. What if she claws back harder? Maria laughed, a short sound like a snapped wire, and said, "Then we bring the receipts and the cameras and the law." The sound felt like a vow. The community that had once been a chorus of murmurs now had a rhythm. Gather, document, demand. But Karen had a move left that surprised everyone. She called a special board meeting and presented a motion to suspend public access temporarily, claiming imminent environmental hazard based on a private consultant's report. The report smelled like greenhouse plastic and was stamped with a logo that matched a firm linked to her husband. The community smelled the fabrication like a blown fuse. People were angry in ways that tasted like iron and old coffee. Tara filed an immediate motion to compel the consultant to appear and produce work files. The court asked for proof that the consultant was independent. The consultant's name, when traced, led to a shell company that smelled of rubber stamping and convenience. The judge asked for bank records. The HOA claimed privileged communications. Privilege smelled like a locked door. The argument escalated to the point where the judge suggested a special master, an independent expert who would review the contested materials. The suggestion tasted like a path forward. The special master's appointment loomed as a potential hammer. It would demand transparency from the HOA and could uncover transactions that might reveal self-dealing. The smell of impending discovery hung heavy. Karen's composure, usually as ironed as her blouse, frayed like an old sweater under the pressure. Someone in the back room of the HOA whispered that Karen's husband was worried about exposure. The rumor tasted like storm clouds. The campaign to hold the HOA accountable had become a community movement. People who had never spoken at meetings were now sharing affidavits, photos, and receipts. The smell of neighborhood solidarity was unfamiliar and bright. The video evidence, clips of the supposed hazardous areas that were, in reality, well used. Swimming holes, circulated online, garnering sympathetic comments, and the kind of views that turn small problems into public ones. The algorithm started doing what it does best: amplify the human story. The metadata hummed: HOA, takedown, illegal, justice, scandal, exposed. The fight had moved from the hall to public opinion. Then came the night before the signature. They had prepared the motion to compel production and arranged a press conference. The air in the bait shop had the low hum of waiting. The coffee had gone cold and political. Tara drafted a settlement letter that, if signed, would have forced the HOA to disclose its records, resign the president, and rescind the fines. It smelled both of concession and victory. They had expected resistance. They had not expected what happened next. A courier arrived with an envelope marked in an unmistakable hand. Inside was a demand: withdraw the suit or face countersuits for defamation and racketeering allegations. The paper smelled like a warning shot, and the font had the clean, threatening inevitability of legal aggression. The HOA's lawyer had drafted a package designed to bury them under the weight of litigation. The smell of legal paper and threat filled the waiting room like a fog. Tara read it slowly, the creases of her forehead making a map. "This is escalation," she said, a low engine of calculation. Daniel felt the air around him tighten like a drum. The community felt bruised and tired, but also committed. The reporter who had been following the story called and asked whether they were ready for the next step. He wanted names, angles, a thumbnail moment. What they did next almost made me lose everything. But it also gave me the win of my life, Daniel said when she asked for a quote. He felt the line land like a promise. They decided not to flinch. Tara drafted counterclaims. The community raised funds for legal fees with bake sales and small donations. The smell of sugar and resolve carried like a hymn. The pressure built until the night before the anticipated signature on the settlement. The judge scheduled a provisional hearing. The courthouse smelled like anticipation, and the ozone of electronics as camera crews prepped. At the hearing, the judge asked for a sealed letter from the HOA explaining their claim of emergency. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she pushed the envelope across the table. The room smelled like polished wood and lemon cleaner. The envelope contained a single page with the consultant's hurried notes and a contractor's assignment, hasty and hot. Tara objected to its authenticity. She asked for phone logs, for invoices, for any transfer that would show an independent review. The judge turned to Karen. The air tasted like a cliff edge. The HOA produced a digital file that, at first glance, looked genuine. But Tara's team had already prepared a digital forensics specialist who traced metadata and found anomalies. The consultant's file had been created after the vote. Timestamps were inconsistent with the claimed inspection date. The specialist's laptop hummed and smelled faintly of warm plastic and determination. The forensic results were a knife that slit the fabric of the HOA's story. The judge leaned in. The courtroom held its breath. The smell of printer ink, old coffee, and legal leather pressed around them. Cameras rolled. The judge's clerk asked for a copy of the forensic report. The HOA's attorney opened his mouth to protest. There was a long, small pause as if the world had re-entered its proper place. Then the HOA's attorney asked for a sidebar and enlisted whisper-soft legal maneuvers. Tara agreed, and they went out of earshot to argue in the way that people argue when their reputations are on the line. Back inside, the audience speculated in low voices. The camera light made faces look like dishes under hot water. Maria held a handkerchief smelling of fried dough. Mr. Lowell's fingers drummed the jury box, each tap a small percussion of anxiety. People leaned forward as if proximity could lend them courage. The judge's expression was unreadable, and in that neutrality, Daniel found a thin thread of hope. The sidebar ended with the HOA's attorney returning to the bench, dragging with him something like exhaustion. He slid a document in front of the judge and said, "Your Honor, we are prepared to enter into negotiations." The words tasted like retreat and calculation. Tara's eyes narrowed. The community outside the courtroom had been chanting in their heads, "Justice, transparency, no more secret deals." Cameras captured the moment with a hungry rhythm. Negotiations began. Negotiations smell like coffee and the metallic tang of concession. They lasted hours, each side feeling the weight of public scrutiny. Finally, as the courthouse clock ticked and the sunlight slanted into the room like a merciless spotlight, a draft settlement lay on the table. It demanded Karen's resignation, an independent audit, and the reversal of the fines in exchange for the community dropping some claims. It smelled like compromise, and a bargain struck in a place where pride meets practicality, and then the pen hovered. Tara's hand wrapped around the pen like a fist. Karen's face tightened, the perfume suddenly too sharp. The cameras leaned in, the lenses hungry for that thumbnail moment. The poised pen, the sweat on a brow, the subtle victory or defeat. The judge watched with the patience of someone who had seen too many dramatic endings and too few clean ones. The air tasted like metal and popcorn, and the collective intake of 1,000 breaths. What happened next would decide how the story read in the headlines, whether it would be a takedown or a faded footnote. The pen hovered, casting a small shadow. That felt larger than the room. The silence was a physical thing, thick and tactile, smelling of anticipation and printer toner. The community that had been coaxed out of quiet now held a thin, brittle hope in their chests. The camera light poised like a scavenger's eye. Outside, a single message thread bubbled on the reporter's phone. Will this be the moment the HOA is exposed for what it is, or the moment it closes ranks and survives? The words in the thread tasted like salt and coffee. Someone in the back of the courtroom clicked their gum sharply, the sound a small, punctuating pop. The pen's shadow stretched like a verdict. The cliffhanger landed with the weight of a hinge. The judge leaned over, the air filled with a quiet static, and the pen, Still hovering, was the pivot between surrender and triumph. The pen hovered. For a heartbeat, the courtroom held its breath, as if the whole town had been funneled into one small, sweating room, and someone had finally lit a match. Karen's fingers trembled like a woman balancing a teacup on a tightrope. Her lips were a thin red line. The judge's eyes were two slow moons. Cameras blinked, their lenses like hungry insects. Outside, a summer thunderstorm muttered in the distance, smelling of hot pavement and electricity. Daniel's folder lay open on the table, the leather cool under his palm, the paper inside smelling faintly of coffee and victory. The pen's point kissed the paper, and then another breath and a sound, a tiny metallic click from the back row, Mr. Lowell clearing his throat, loud as a cannon. The pen did not move. The cliff hung there, heavy as an anchor. Then the judge leaned forward and spoke in a voice that felt like a gavel wrapped in velvet. "Before you sign, counsel, the court requires full disclosure." The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. Karen's face drained. The color fled like birds. In the pockets of her composure, little things trembled. A cracked nail, a bead of sweat, the slight loosening in the smile that had been her armor. Daniel smelled lemon cleaner and dust. He tasted copper from the adrenaline at the back of his tongue. The pen's shadow lengthened, as if it too were considering which side to fall on. He remembered how his grandfather used to say that a pen can be a sword, but also a key. This one might unlock everything, or close it forever. The cliffhanger. Snapped. Would she sign? The answer would change the neighborhood's map. Flashback to the filing cabinet in the bait shop where the fight had started. There were envelopes there that smelled like old summers and printer toner. Receipts, stamped checks, and a sheet marked vendor selection, with a scrawl that matched the contractor's handwriting. There was also the consultant's report, PDFs with altered metadata and a timestamp that read like a lie. Daniel had felt that lie with his hands. He could trace its edges, smell its glue, understand its construction the way a carpenter knows a bad knot in wood. He had learned to read time codes the way other men read faces. When Tara's forensics expert had smiled at her findings, the smile had tasted like gasoline and hope. The special master's report would be a scalpel. The cliffhanger then had been smaller but sharper. Would the special master find enough to show fabrication? The answer came slow. Back in the present, the judge ordered the HOA to produce all related digital files for independent review, and asked for a sworn explanation of the consultant's credentials. Karen's cheeks tightened. She had 1,000 ways to say no without moving her mouth, but the ink on the page was looking more like a confession than a defense. The room smelled of rain and the nervous acetone of too much perfume. Someone in the corner laughed softly and then stopped, embarrassed by the sound. The county clerk's assistant, who had smelled of ink and a lifetime of small indignities, tapped her pen. The sound was like a metronome set to accountability. The quiet was a knife. Would the paper prove true? The pen hovered, and the story held its breath again. They huddled outside the courthouse under a small awning where the afternoon's rain chased down the street, turning dust into mud and the sky into a low, wet ceiling. The smell of rain and frying oil from a nearby food truck mixed like odd promises. The reporter asked questions that tasted like appetite. "Is this the moment?" she asked, her microphone cold and expectant. Daniel looked at Tara, whose jaw worked like perhaps the jaw of a woman who'd gnawed nails down to the quick preparing for impact. He smelled her coffee and the leather of her briefcase. He answered with a bluntness born of hours spent sorting paper into truth and lie. "We don't need a moment. We need documents." The cliffhanger tightened. Would those documents arrive? Intact or in tatters? The special master's review landed like a thunderclap 2 days later. The forensic report smelled like ozone and cold plastic. It came with redacted emails and a chain of timestamps that pinched the lie to the table. The consultant's inspection file had been created on a laptop at a time when the consultant claimed to be off-site. Entries had been modified after the vote. Crucial metadata was missing. Tara's eyes shone with a kind of grim joy as she read the findings aloud in the bait shop while rain hissed against the windows and the smell of fried fish and graphite filled the room. The evidence was a geometry of guilt. The cliffhanger after the reading was small and sharp. What would Karen do when the proof was aired in a courtroom with cameras? She doubled down. Denial was her first fingertip. Anger followed. When the special master's findings were submitted to the court, Karen accused the report of bias and filed an emergency motion to suppress the evidence as unauthorized forensic intrusion, the words tasting like paperwork and desperation. The HOA's lawyer, at this point ragged like an old flag, argued that the special master had exceeded his scope. His voice was syrupy and rehearsed and smelled faintly of stale coffee. The judge smelled of wooden justice and patience. He did not strike the report. He asked for verification. The cliffhanger. Did the evidence withstand scrutiny? The answer creaked like a locked door. The discovery phase widened into something that felt less like sport and more like excavation. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records exhaled their contents like labored confessions. Emails that had been treated like private gossip now sat under hot lights, their headers exposed and raw. The air smelled like burning paper and something like relief. The ledger lines matched the invoice for shoreline remediation to transfers, clearing through an account controlled by Karen's husband. He had been careful only when he thought no one was watching. His carelessness had been a thin veil. Mr. Lowell's dry cough sounded like approval as he skimmed a printout. The sequence of deposits echoed the invoice timeline like a drumbeat confirming a march. The cliffhanger. Would the court see this as self-dealing or a coincidental bookkeeping error? When Tara called it self-dealing in open court, her voice cut like steel. She explained fiduciary duty in simple, absolute terms. Board members owe duties of loyalty and care. They must avoid conflicts of interest. If they benefit personally from association funds without full disclosure and proper approval, they can be held liable. The words landed and echoed in the courtroom like a bell. The judge's pen hovered again, now with a different weight. Karen's husband's face crumpled as the ledger printouts were displayed on a screen, the numbers glaring like teeth. The smell of printer ink filled the room like testimony. The HOA's defense began to unravel in a visible way. The more they explained, the more assumptions collapsed. The cliffhanger tightened. Would the court order rescission or damages? The board's vulnerability revealed itself slowly, and then with a suddenness like a hinge breaking. A former treasurer, a woman with hands always stained with cigarette ash and ledger dust, came forward and told the court about informal approvals, about meetings that had been scheduled and not publicized, about minutes that had been created after votes were supposedly taken. Her voice was rough as dried rope, but honest as a ledger. The smell of her presence was stale tobacco and courage. She handed over a ledger copy with penciled notes and dates that contradicted the HOA's official minutes. The contradiction tasted like iron. The judge adjusted his glasses. The audience inhaled. The cliffhanger. Would those contradictions be enough to dissolve the board's claims? Social pressure did its work in parallel with legal pressure. Stories spread across platforms. The keywords, HOA, takedown, illegal, justice, scandal, exposed, hummed in metadata and comment threads. People who had once been invisible found themselves spoken for. The smell of collective action was sweet and slightly terrifying. Local businesses rallied. Bake sale fundraisers for legal fees, donation jars at the bait shop, a crowdsourced legal defense fund with a tally that smelled of pennies and hope. Cameras that once watched for drama now focused on human faces with tired jawlines and bright, persistent eyes. The HOA's allies shrank like shadows at noon. The cliffhanger. Could public shame force a settlement even before a final ruling? But Karen had one last card. A private leverage play that smelled like old money and old grudges. She presented a sealed affidavit from an anonymous, concerned member alleging improper conduct by Daniel unrelated to the lake. A claim of property damage, unfounded in time to look like a counterweight to his allegations. The smear campaign wasn't subtle. It was a throwdown in the mud. The smell of this tactic was like cheap cologne and wet dirt. Tara tore into it, requesting authentication and exposing the affidavit's improbable origins. The anonymous affiant had no phone records, no public presence, an online footprint like a ghost. The cliffhanger. Would the smear stick or be stripped as fabrication? The forensic timeline came back clean. No phone pings, no physical evidence. The affidavit collapsed under air and scrutiny like a house of cards in a wind tunnel. The judge was unimpressed by theatrics. In a voice that courted neither favor nor drama, he spoke about sanctions for filings that constitute fraud upon the court. The words had teeth. The smell in the room shifted from mud to iron. Karen's smile cracked. She tasted the bitter dregs of risk. The cliffhanger. Would the judge sanction the HOA or merely admonish them and let the matter simmer? In the end, it was a small, human confession that broke the back of the case. Karen's husband, who had always been careful to remain a private presence, came to the stand, and his voice was a low, awkward thing. He admitted that he had submitted the contractor's bid after the motion to approve funding had been passed because he believed it would be easier that way. The words were like a dropped tool. He had assumed the vote was procedural, a rubber stamp he could retrofit. The smell of engine oil and regret hovered over him. His admission matched the ledger. The judge looked at the board and then at Karen. Her practiced masks slipped. The town's collective patience, pooled like water in a dry basin, spilled out. The legal machinery moved briskly after that. The judge found that the HOA had breached its fiduciary duties and that certain amendments had been improperly recorded. Orders followed: rescission of the unlawful amendment, reversal of the fines, and a mandate for an independent audit. The court also ordered the HOA to pay partial restitution for legal fees incurred by the homeowners. A small vindication that tasted like victory and spare change. The HOA president was censured. Her resignation was requested, and with dignity thinning like paper, she stepped down. The smell of judicial ink and lemon cleaner filled the room again, but this time with the sweetness of consequence. The cliffhanger here was not whether justice would be done, but how the community would repair itself afterward. The aftermath felt tactile. The lake returned slowly, to the easy songs of frogs and kids. The dock creaked under new shoes, and the air tasted less like iron and more like forgiveness. There were cleanups, neighbor-to-neighbor apologies, and a community vote for transparent oversight. Daniel stood with his grandfather's deed in his hand and watched as people who had been wary for months began to reclaim the picnic tables and fishing poles. The smell of barbecue returned to Saturday afternoons, a normality that felt like triumph. He had pushed for structural changes, mandatory public notice procedures, limits on board member transactions with vendors, and a requirement that all amendments have a supermajority vote and audited documentation. The new rules smelled bureaucratic and righteous. One of the most startling outcomes was not legal, but cultural. Karen's resignation opened a door that had been wedged shut. Neighbors who had been silent found new confidence. They learned the code that used to be hidden in legalese. Many of them discovered that governance is not merely the domain of clipped speeches and lemon cakes. It is a set of tangible actions that require attention. They started attending meetings not to applaud but to oversee. The bait shop hosted workshops. The volunteer treasurer taught people the basics of nonprofit accounting in a room that smelled of bait and black coffee. The community's trust, once broken, was put under a microscope and gradually rebuilt with the care of a builder replacing a rotten beam. There was also the quiet satisfaction of seeing the ledger lines reconcile. The audit returned with a list of recommended controls and a terse section labeled self-dealing concerns. The report's language was formal, but the meaning was plain. People had used their positions for private gain. The HOA board was reconstituted with a slate of new officers who had no contractor ties and whose first act was to publish their meeting minutes with full transparency. They installed a lockbox for bids and required at least 3 independent quotes for any project. The smell of fresh paint and accountability replaced the former odor of secrecy. On a small Saturday after the storm season, the community held a meeting at the lakeside. The sun tasted of newness. Children ran barefoot, squealing, the water slapping against their ankles with a sound like small cymbals. Daniel watched from the dock, the leather folder now a faded thing tucked in his truck, the edges softened like a dog's ear. He tasted the warm glaze of peach pie from the bake sale and the faint diesel tang of a neighbor's truck. He felt the lake's cool wind on his face, and in that moment recognized how deeply ordinary justice can feel. Less like a proclamation, more like a repaired fence, a returned dock, a shared grill. People laughed. The smell of sunscreen and fried fish rose and wrapped the crowd in a normality that had been hard-won. Yet, endings are never entirely clean. Karen moved away quietly, the silver SUV sold and replaced by a small, rented sedan. The rumor was that her husband's landscaping business took a hit and that contractors who used to sign on for projects now avoided the entanglement of community bidding. People still whispered about the way power curves when unexamined. The lake, however, stayed public and bright. The riparian rights were clearer now because of the court's action and the community's vigilance. The deed lines that had once been obscured by shorthand and omission were now flagged in county records with clear, binding language about access and use. The smell of fresh filing and municipal ink made Daniel smile. There was one final legal fact Tara dropped, in a small, triumphant aside, the way a seamstress might point out the hidden stitch that made the seam hold. An HOA can be dissolved, under state law in extreme cases, usually by a supermajority vote of members or by a court order when the association is not meeting its obligations or has engaged in fraud. Dissolution is rare and messy, but the real power homeowners have is transparency and the ability to demand audits, rescission, and proper notice. Records matter. The knowledge landed like a blueprint. The crowd cheered quietly, the sound like curtains being drawn on a long, dark window. The cliffhanger resolved into a kind of assurance. Legal tools exist, and people who learn them can change outcomes. Months later, when someone mentioned the word scandal at the gas station, the conversation tasted like old news and new wisdom. "She fined me $1,000 for swimming in my own lake," Daniel would tell the stranger, voice dry with a smile. "So, I wrote her a bill for $5,000, he'd add, and the listener would laugh because the story had become an emblem, not of revenge, but of accountability. The spouse at the pump would ask, "So what happened?" And Daniel would say, "We fixed it." The words were small but for once accurate. The true resolution was in the small daily things. The kids who relearned how to cannonball from the dock without fear of a fine. The elderly man who once fished in silence now gave lessons. The HOA meetings that turned into civic training sessions rather than theater productions of power. The smell of charcoal and laughter replaced the metallic tang of threat. The community had learned to steward its own safety, to police its own governance, and to hold its leaders accountable. They had turned scandal into a lesson. They had exposed what was illegal and made it clear that justice could be practical. For Daniel, the victory was personal and public. He still kept his grandfather's deed in the leather folder, tattered now and warm from the many hands that had touched it. He would sometimes run his thumb across the ink and think about petals of memory. Summers, the creak of the dock, the way light used to fall in a forgiving pattern. When he walked the lake's edge, he could hear the children's laughter and the occasional splash, and it tasted like permission. The fight had changed him. He had gained patience and a peculiar sort of quiet strength that was different from the steady weight of a firefighter's hands. It was the strength of someone who had learned to use law and community as tools, not weapons. He stood one evening watching the sunset paint the water with a slow, generous hand. The air smelled of wet cedar and warm bread from a neighbor's kitchen. Someone shouted a joke from across the bank. A dog barked. The light on the lake made 1,000 tiny promises that would be kept only if people kept paying attention. He thought of the pen that had hovered in the courtroom, and how a single choice, to sign or refuse, had felt like the hinge of fate. He smiled and felt the slow uncoiling of relief. The story that began with a $1,000 fine had ended with restitution, reform, and a community that learned the price of silence. "Where are you watching from?" he asked once during a small local news interview, the camera catching the laugh lines around his eyes. Comment your city and share your HOA horror. If your community has a story like this, speak up. He leaned into the microphone and added, a little softer but no less direct, "If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to hear this. The more people know, the harder it is for HOAs to get away with this." The lines were precise and practiced now. They tasted like calluses and peach pie. In the end, justice wasn't a dramatic headline or a single courtroom slam. It was a slow, practical thing stitched into minutes and ledgers and new rules. It smelled of coffee and summer cleanup and the calm after a storm. The lake stayed public. The dock stayed full. The community, bruised but wiser, watched the horizon and tended the things that mattered. Records, meetings, and the simple joy of splashing in a place that belonged to everyone. The final image was small and perfectly ordinary. Children shrieking with laughter as they cannonballed into the water, the splash ringing like a bell, the smell of chlorine and lakeweed and sunscreen in the air. And a man with a folded leather folder in his truck, smiling because he had turned a fine into a teaching moment, a scandal into a lesson, and a mean-spirited bylaw into a better future. If this story stirred something, tell us where you're watching from, share your HOA horror below, and tag a neighbor. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe so we can keep exposing the illegal and fighting for justice. Want another HOA takedown? Like, share, and stay tuned. The next story might be your own.